The winter of 1971 settled over Bitter Valley like a held breath, the kind that made even seasoned locals lock their doors early and keep their eyes low when the wind carried certain sounds. Long before the headlines came, before the government trucks rolled in and the radio hosts begged listeners not to panic, there were only the 3 children, barefoot, skeletal, and half-frozen, standing in a clearing as if they didn't know whether to run or collapse. The hikers who found them would later say the kids didn't cry, didn't ask for help, didn't even look surprised. They simply stared, as though they'd already seen something far worse than death. The children were taken to St. Elwood's Clinic, wrapped in blankets, their lips blue from Montana's winter bite. But warmth changed nothing. They kept glancing at the corners of the room, as if expecting someone to step out of the shadows. When asked their names, they only drew shaky circles on scraps of paper, the same symbol over and over. The nurses thought it was trauma. The sheriff thought it was fear. None of them considered it might be a warning. It wasn't until a deputy checked old missing persons reports that their identity surfaced. The Darrington Clan, a self-isolated family who lived miles off the grid and vanished almost a year earlier. The valley had whispered about them even before the disappearance, strange lights on their land, distant chanting on winter nights, the kind of rumors people laugh off during the day but avoid mentioning after sunset. And now, the only known survivors of that family sat in a hospital room, flinching whenever the floorboards creaked. Authorities drove to the Darrington homestead expecting a tragic accident. Instead, they found a house swallowed by silence, with dinner plates still on the table, beds unmade, and a cellar door chained 3 times over from the outside. The deputies would later swear the chains were not meant to keep intruders out, but something else in. And yet, when the locks were cut open and the cellar door groaned into the dark, there were no bodies waiting. No footprints. No signs of life at all, just the lingering cold, and the uneasy feeling that the house itself was holding its breath, listening. Back at the clinic, the eldest child finally spoke. One sentence. One whisper. Enough to send a tremor through the sheriff's hands as he wrote it down. They went below, the child said, eyes wide and empty. But not all of them came back. And that was the moment Bitter Valley understood this wasn't a missing persons case. It was the beginning of something far worse, something the rest of America would hear about only in fragments, never the full truth, never the part that made the federal agents go pale when they stepped inside those tunnels for the first time. The discovery in 1971 began as nothing more than an ordinary weekend hike for 3 friends who had grown up wandering the outskirts of Bitter Valley, familiar with every bend in its trails and every old logging road scattered across the mountainside. That winter, the landscape felt unusually still, smothered in a cold so heavy it muted even the sound of distant wildlife. The hikers were used to strange silences in the woods, but on that particular morning, the quiet felt different, expectant, as though the forest itself were waiting for something to be uncovered. They followed a path that had been partially erased by snowfall, leading deeper toward a part of the valley people rarely visited. It was there, near a decaying barn that looked ready to collapse under its own weight, that one of them noticed the faintest hint of movement. At first they thought it was an animal, maybe a deer seeking shelter from the cold, but as they stepped closer, they realized the shapes weren't animals at all. 3 children stood just inside the shadow of the barn, barefoot despite the snow, their clothes in tatters, their faces pale enough to blend with the frost. What struck the hikers most was the stillness of the kids, the way they stood perfectly silent, not crying or shouting or reaching out for help. Instead, they watched the newcomers as if unsure whether the world outside the barn could be trusted. Their eyes were sunken, their limbs thin and trembling, but they held themselves with an unsettling composure that made one of the hikers instinctively step back. Children in distress usually ran or clung or begged. These children did none of that. They simply waited. When the hikers approached slowly, speaking in gentle voices, the children didn't respond. The smallest one flinched at the crunch of snow beneath approaching boots, drawing back into the barn's shadow. The oldest child moved slightly forward, not in defense but almost as if warning the others to stay behind. The hikers exchanged uneasy glances. They couldn't leave them there, not in that cold, not in that condition. One offered his coat, placing it gently around the shoulders of the eldest child, who accepted it without a word, without even blinking away from the forest behind him, as though expecting something or someone to emerge. Realizing the children were too weak to walk far, the hikers carried them one by one out of the collapsing barn. As they did, they noticed small details that made the discovery even more disturbing: scratches along the children's arms, dirt caked into their hair, and a smell that clung to them, something damp, earthy, and unfamiliar, like the scent of old tunnels or places where sunlight never reached. They began the long trek back, unaware that what they had found was only the first layer of something far more terrifying, and that the silence of the children was not fear, but memory. When authorities finally identified the 3 children, the revelation did not come with relief but with a chill that spread through the entire sheriff's department. Their names, whispered in confusion by overworked deputies, belonged to the Darrington Clan, a family that had always lived so far beyond the valley's edges that most locals only spoke of them in rumors. For years the Darringtons existed like ghosts on the outskirts of Bitter Valley, tucked deep into the northern woods where the land dipped into old mining territory and sunlight reached the ground at strange angles. They were known for avoiding town, trading only when necessary, and moving through the world with a secrecy that made them a constant subject of local folklore. You could live in Bitter Valley your whole life and never see a single Darrington up close, yet still feel their presence whenever talk of strange lights or distant chanting came up during long winter nights. Their disappearance almost a year earlier had barely made the news. People assumed they had finally moved on, perhaps chased off by the worsening winters or the collapse of the old mining system. A missing persons report had been filed, but even that was thin. No extended family had come forward, no neighbors could recall their routines clearly, and no one in town had any real idea how many people lived on the secluded property. Some believed there were a dozen Darringtons, some insisted there were far more. The only thing everyone agreed on was that they kept to themselves, and that was enough for most to leave them alone. But now, with 3 children discovered in a state no child should ever endure, the story shifted from rumor to grim reality. When the sheriff cross-referenced their ages and physical features with the sparse information available, the match was undeniable. The children were the last known young members of the family. What unsettled the sheriff most was not the confirmation itself but what it implied. If these 3 were here, starved, silent, and seemingly abandoned, then where were the rest of the Darringtons? The adults, the other rumored children, the elders who supposedly enforced strict rules on the family's isolation. The valley had whispered for years that something strange lived out on their land, some tradition or belief system no one else understood. Now those whispers felt heavier, more dangerous, as if the truth had been hovering all along, just out of reach. Deputies moved quickly to piece together whatever history they could, but what they found was a patchwork of contradictions. Some said the Darringtons were religious fanatics, others insisted they were hiding from something beneath the valley itself. The children's reappearance didn't answer these questions, it multiplied them, turning what should have been a simple identification into the first step toward a mystery darker than anyone was prepared for. Despite being provided with warm beds, steady meals, and the gentle reassurance of nurses trained to handle trauma, the Darrington children remained locked inside a silence that felt far too intentional for their age. At first, everyone assumed they were simply overwhelmed, pulled from the frozen woods, separated from whatever life they had known, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and sterile hallways. But as days passed, the silence stopped resembling fear and began to feel like a carefully guarded secret. They reacted to their surroundings only in the smallest ways: a flinch when someone dropped a tray, a shiver when the lights flickered, a quick glance toward a dark corner as though something invisible had moved through it. Doctors tried coaxing them with soft voices, toys, even therapy techniques meant for children who had endured long-term trauma, but nothing worked. They would not speak. They would not cry. They would not even look directly at the people trying to help them. Then the drawings began. It started with a single sheet of paper left on the bedside table, covered in frantic, looping lines that barely formed a shape. By the next day, the drawings had become more deliberate. One child sketched the outline of a jagged tunnel, the pencil pressed so hard against the paper that it tore through the page in places. Another child drew tall, dark shapes standing behind a crooked house, their limbs too long, their heads tilted in unnatural angles. The eldest drew a symbol, a circle split by a downward line, surrounded by uneven marks like claw slashes. It was strange and unrecognizable, but the children repeated it again and again, sometimes filling entire sheets with nothing but that one symbol. Nurses collected the drawings in silence, unsure whether to treat them as signs of progress or warnings they didn't yet understand. When the sheriff was shown the pages, he felt a tightening in his chest. The shapes, the tunnels, the strange symbol, it all suggested the children remembered something that words could not contain. The eldest child, who seemed to carry a burden heavier than the others, often froze mid-drawing to stare at a spot on the wall or the ceiling, as if replaying memories too dark to articulate. No matter how many times the staff asked simple questions, "Where is your family? What happened to you? Who drew these things?" the children remained silent, their only answers appearing in pencil and charcoal. What confused everyone most was the consistency. 3 children, 3 different personalities, yet all drawing the same symbols, the same dark shapes, the same twisting underground passages. It became clear that these drawings weren't random expressions or nightmares. They were fragments of something real, something shared, something that had followed the children out of the woods. And while the adults around them struggled to interpret the meaning, the children seemed to be trying to say one thing without speaking it aloud, that whatever had happened to the Darrington family, whatever had driven them into isolation, had not ended when the children were found. When investigators returned to the abandoned Darrington property, they expected a tragic scene, perhaps evidence of an accident, an animal attack, or families who had simply succumbed to the brutal Montana winter. But the moment they stepped onto the land, it became clear that nothing about the homestead aligned with any normal explanation. The house stood crooked against the tree line, its windows dark and half-shattered, yet there were no signs of a struggle. Snow had drifted through broken panes and settled in untouched layers on the floors, as if nothing living had crossed the threshold for months. Dinner plates sat on the wooden table, crusted with old food, silverware bowed where hands had once held them. Chairs rested unevenly, some knocked over, but not violently, more like someone had risen abruptly and never returned. Beds were unmade, quilts pulled halfway to the floor. A kettle lay on its side by the stovetop, and though the metal had long cooled, the way it rested made it seem as though it had been dropped mid-motion. The deputies spread through the house calling out for anyone, even though the silence pressing against the walls made it obvious no answer would come. It was the kind of stillness that seemed to listen rather than echo, as if the house itself remembered what had happened inside it. They searched every room, every closet, every corner where a terrified family might hide, but nothing. Not a footprint, not a trail, not even a piece of cloth suggesting someone had fled into the forest. The absence of adults was absolute, a void so complete that it unsettled even the most seasoned officers. Outside, the yard was equally barren. Snow lay smooth, unbroken except for old animal tracks and the sway of dead branches. The barn where the children had been found was checked again, but there were no hidden spaces that could have concealed additional people. The deputies expanded the search to the edges of the property, but the thick woods swallowed noise, light, and certainty. It was as though the entire Darrington clan had simply dissolved into the cold air, leaving only their home as a silent witness. The most disturbing detail came when investigators examined the belongings left behind. Coats still hung by the door, boots still lined the wall, family photographs remained nailed to the cabin beams. These weren't people who had packed up and moved on, these were people who had vanished without preparing, without warning, without taking even the essentials someone would instinctively grab before leaving their home. Every clue suggested the Darrington adults had left abruptly, but the lack of tracks or any sign of movement suggested they hadn't left at all. The longer the investigators stood on the property, the more the land felt heavy with something unspoken, as if the answer to what happened lingered just beyond the edges of their understanding, waiting for them to look in the wrong place. The discovery of the cellar was never part of the original plan. Investigators had intended only to document the property, mark any evidence, and return once reinforcement teams arrived. But one deputy, combing the rear section of the house, noticed scratches along the floorboards beneath a crooked rug. When he pulled the rug aside, a wooden hatch revealed itself, sealed shut with 3 heavy chains that didn't match the age or craftsmanship of the rest of the home. The chains were newer, industrial, far stronger than anything a rural family would typically have access to. This immediately raised questions: who had locked it, and what had they been trying to keep inside? Cutting through the chains took longer than anyone expected. Each one resisted, as though tightened by someone with desperate hands and a fear that still hung in the air. When the final lock clattered to the ground, a cold draft breathed from the cellar, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and something older, something metallic and sharp on the edges. The deputies exchanged uneasy looks before lifting the hatch. Hinges creaked in protest, and a darkness pooled beneath them that their flashlights struggled to penetrate. The cellar was deeper than they anticipated, carved not like a simple storage space but like an old chamber, hollowed out far below the natural foundation of the house. As the investigators descended, the air grew colder, thick in a way that made breathing feel labored. The walls weren't smooth, they were marked with carvings, uneven symbols that mirrored the ones the children had drawn at the clinic. Some were etched deeply into the wood, others scratched hastily, as if someone had carved them in panic. Strange artifacts lay scattered on makeshift shelves, bundles of dried plants no one recognized, animal bones arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate ritual, and small woven figures that twisted into unnatural shapes. A rusted lantern still sat upright on a table, long extinguished but positioned as though someone had placed it there moments before vanishing. In the far corner of the cellar, beneath layers of dust and old cloth, the deputies found large iron rings bolted into the floor. The metal was scratched and bent, as if something had strained against them with immense force. The discovery forced the investigators to step back, piecing together the implication of restraints hidden in a rural family's basement. Something, or someone, had been held here. The marks on the rings and the deep grooves in the wooden floor suggested whatever had been chained was not calm, nor passive. The cellar felt like a place built to contain, not to store. Every symbol, every artifact, every detail whispered the same unsettling truth. The Darrington adults hadn't been trying to keep the outside world from coming in. They had been trying to keep something trapped below, something they feared enough to chain behind multiple locks and reinforce with carvings that resembled warnings more than decorations. And now that the children had been found, and the cellar opened, the investigators began to fear that whatever had once been restrained might no longer be there at all. 4 days the eldest Darrington child had remained motionless and mute, staring through doctors and deputies as if they were nothing more than passing shadows. He watched the room constantly, his eyes tracing invisible paths along the ceiling and corners, always avoiding direct questions. The younger two clung to him, sleeping only when he curled around them protectively, waking with panic whenever he loosened his grip. Nurses began to wonder if he had taken on the role of a parent long before the children were found, as though the responsibility of survival had fallen entirely onto his thin, trembling shoulders. Yet nothing, no comfort, no coaxing, no carefully worded question, broke his silence, not until the night a thunderstorm rolled across the valley. The storm struck without warning, rattling the clinic's windows and sending sharp cracks of thunder shuddering down its hallways. When the lights flickered, the youngest child started whimpering, burying his face into the blankets. The eldest sat up immediately, every muscle in his body tightening as though he recognized the darkness between each flicker. The storm seemed to drag him back into memories he had been trying to hold down. His breathing grew shallow, and he pressed his hands over his ears, but not in fear of the thunder. It was as if he was listening for something else, something the storm reminded him of. A nurse approached to soothe him, but he recoiled, shaking his head and pointing toward the shadows pooling in the far corner of the room. His eyes widened with the same terror he had shown the moment the hikers found him in the barn. The other 2 children followed his gaze, their bodies stiffening as though they too sensed something shifting in the dark. The nurse stood frozen, unable to understand what they were seeing or remembering. And then, without warning, the oldest child broke his silence. His voice emerged as a whisper, cracked and halting, as though the words themselves carried weight he had been terrified to release. He didn't speak answers, not explanations, not even complete thoughts. He spoke warnings, fragmented pieces of a nightmare that didn't sound like imagination. He said there had been nights in the Darrington home when the floors shook, when something moved beneath them. He said the adults had promised the children were safe as long as the cellar stayed locked. He said the chanting wasn't meant to summon anything but to keep something asleep. The more he spoke, the more frantic his voice grew, until the nurse had to hold his shoulders to keep him from trembling off the bed. By the time the sheriff arrived, the child had curled into himself, exhausted and shaking, whispering only one sentence over and over. It wasn't a plea or a cry for help. It was a statement, a memory that chilled every adult who heard it. They tried to stop it, he whispered, rocking back and forth. But it woke up anyway. The disappearance of the two deputies began as a routine follow-up, the kind of late-night check that experienced officers usually handled without a second thought. They had been assigned to keep an eye on the Darrington property after the discovery of the cellar, making sure no curious locals or wildlife tampered with the scene before the federal team arrived in the morning. Both men were familiar with the valley's eeriness after dark, how the cold seemed sharper, how the silence settled heavily between the trees, but neither believed the place was dangerous. They joked on the drive up, their voices cutting through the hum of the patrol car heater, unaware that their laughter would be the last sound anyone heard from them. When they reached the property, the house stood exactly as before, its windows hollow and its frame leaning as if tired of holding secrets. Snowflakes drifted through the air, settling onto the deputies' jackets as they stepped out to do a quick perimeter sweep. One circled toward the barn, shining his flashlight across splintered boards and empty stalls. The other approached the house, pausing at the warped front door with the uneasy feeling that it had shifted slightly since their last visit, as if the structure itself had exhaled. Their radios crackled sporadically with static, the kind that usually vanished once they moved closer to the mountainside tower, but tonight it grew louder, drowning out their voices whenever they tried to communicate. Inside the patrol car, the dash camera blinked steadily, capturing nothing unusual except the faint glow of the house in the distance. Minutes passed. Then more. The first deputy's flashlight beam flickered for a moment before disappearing entirely. The second deputy's boots left faint impressions in the fresh snow leading around the side of the house, tracks that followed the wall toward the cellar door. The car engine idled, warming the empty seats, while the heater hissed quietly. No shouts, no gunfire, no call for backup. Just the wind, low and restless, brushing against the trees. By the time backup arrived, the property looked untouched, almost eerily peaceful. The patrol car remained where it had been parked, engine still running, headlights casting long, pale beams through the drifting snow. Both deputies' radios lay on the driver's seat, one still humming with static. Their footprints led halfway around the house before dissolving into the untouched snow, as if the men had simply stepped out of existence. No struggle. No blood. No signs of a hasty retreat. It was as though something had swallowed them whole, quietly and efficiently, leaving behind nothing but the question of what could move through the dark without leaving a trace. The only clue, if it could be called that, was the open cellar hatch. The chains that had previously sealed it lay scattered on the ground, and the wooden door hung crookedly, swaying gently as if nudged by a breeze that did not exist. When federal agents arrived in Bitter Valley, the locals immediately sensed that the case had shifted into a realm they were no longer meant to touch. The agents came in unmarked vehicles, their presence deliberate but quiet, moving through the valley with the precision of people accustomed to secrecy. They established a perimeter around the Darrington property, sealing it off with bright yellow tape and armed guards, instructing everyone to keep their distance. Rumors spread instantly, journalists were turned away, deputies were told not to speak to anyone, and neighbors who had grown up hearing the valley's whispers were met with curt warnings to forget what they had seen or heard. The sudden authority of the federal presence lent a weight to the situation, signaling that this was no ordinary disappearance, no typical missing persons case. Inside the property, the agents moved with careful efficiency. They photographed the house, documented the cellar, and catalogued every artifact the local authorities had already noted. Their methods were clinical, almost ritualistic, and yet the tension in the air suggested a deeper urgency. When pressed by local law enforcement about the nature of their investigation, the federal agents offered only vague assurances, speaking in terms of national security and sensitive operations. It became clear that whatever had happened with the Darrington family was not meant for public knowledge, and the children, now in federal custody, were treated more like evidence than survivors. The agents rarely allowed anyone close, even medical personnel, and questions were answered with curt nods or silence. Residents of Bitter Valley began to whisper among themselves, comparing notes on what the children had drawn, what had been found in the cellar, and the chilling warnings the eldest child had given. The answers were always the same: too little, and too unsettling to share. The agents also began restricting access to the surrounding woods, declaring large swaths off-limits under the guise of ongoing evidence collection. Hikers, hunters, and even locals who had wandered the area for decades were turned back at the edge of these invisible borders. Some reported seeing figures moving through the forest at night, agents, drones, or perhaps something else, but no one could confirm anything. Fear began to take hold, a subtle dread that spread quietly through the community, reinforced by the knowledge that even speaking about the Darrington case could draw the attention of men in dark suits who refused to answer questions. The valley, which had always been quiet but alive with stories and superstition, fell into a deeper silence, as if it knew something beyond human comprehension had arrived to claim its secrets. What most unsettled the locals was not the physical presence of the agents but the implication behind it, that whatever had happened to the Darringtons was bigger than them, bigger than the valley, and larger than anything anyone in Bitter Valley or the country was meant to understand. The secrecy was absolute, and the knowledge that the children's recollections and the artifacts from the cellar were now controlled by an authority that would not reveal the truth left a lingering unease that spread from house to house, like a shadow that could not be shaken. When the federal agents began their excavation of the land surrounding the Darrington property, they quickly realized that what lay beneath the surface was far more extensive than anyone had anticipated. Initial reports from local authorities had hinted at shallow tunnels, perhaps old root cellars or small animal passages, but these turned out to be only the surface layer of an intricate and deliberate network stretching for miles beneath the valley. The agents discovered entrances hidden behind fallen logs, beneath rotting floorboards, and even inside walls of outbuildings. Each tunnel was reinforced with crude supports, some made from old timber salvaged from the house itself, others carved directly into the earth and stone. The air was damp and heavy, carrying a smell of decay that made the agents tighten their masks. The deeper they went, the colder it became, as though the tunnels themselves absorbed warmth from anything entering them. Inside, the tunnels were filled with remnants of the Darrington adults' secret life. Strange markings covered the walls, symbols the children had drawn, along with additional carvings that suggested long-term ritualistic activity. Piles of charred wood, fragments of fabric, and small animal bones were arranged deliberately in corners and along the walls. There were even crude living spaces, tiny rooms with straw bedding and remnants of meals that had been left untouched for months or perhaps years. Everything was methodical, as if someone had built a functioning underground world designed to remain hidden from prying eyes, a world where the family had lived according to rules that outsiders could neither guess nor comprehend. What made the network most unnerving was its scale. It twisted and branched unpredictably, with some passages leading into dead ends and others spiraling downward into caverns far larger than anyone expected. Occasionally, investigators would hear faint echoes of water dripping, though no natural source was apparent, giving the tunnels a sound that was almost alive. Some areas were reinforced with iron bars, shackles, and other restraints, the remnants of practices the children had hinted at but could not describe in full. These findings confirmed that the tunnels were more than just a hiding place, they were a controlled environment for activities the family considered sacred, secret, or perhaps even necessary for survival. The agents documented the tunnels meticulously, using lighting and photography, but even their professional detachment could not erase the sense of dread that pervaded every step. There was an unmistakable feeling of being watched, as though the tunnels themselves remembered those who had walked them. It became evident that the Darrington adults had devoted generations to constructing this hidden world, and that whatever had transpired underground had not ended when the children were found. Each discovery deepened the mystery, suggesting that the true scope of the family's isolation, their beliefs, and their actions extended far beyond the property, reaching into a labyrinth of secrets that was still alive beneath the valley, waiting to be fully uncovered. At the very heart of the tunnel network, where the walls closed in so tightly that even a single flashlight beam seemed swallowed whole, investigators uncovered a chamber that defied any explanation. Unlike the rest of the tunnels, which had felt like secret living spaces or storage areas, this room radiated a deliberate malevolence. Its walls were carved with symbols more intricate than those seen elsewhere, symbols that pulsed with a sense of warning, as if etched to communicate something incomprehensible to anyone not initiated into the family's dark traditions. The floor was littered with remnants of objects that appeared ceremonial, bone fragments arranged in deliberate patterns, melted wax from countless candles, and small effigies crudely fashioned from cloth and twine. The smell was overpowering, a mix of damp earth, burnt resin, and something metallic, like blood left to oxidize over years. Every investigator who entered felt an immediate chill, a sensation that this room had absorbed fear and obsession over generations. It was here that the full scope of the Darrington family's practices became undeniable. The evidence suggested that the adults had not merely isolated themselves for survival or eccentricity, they had engaged in something that was both methodical and ritualistic, a system of control and secrecy that the children had only partially survived. Patterns in the carvings and effigies implied generations of repeated behavior, each layer of the chamber documenting acts too sinister to be publicly revealed. The investigators found journals and scraps of notes, hastily written and nearly indecipherable, hinting at ceremonies, threats, and warnings, each word more chilling than the last. There was an unmistakable suggestion that the family believed they were containing something, an entity, a power, or a force that, if released, could have consequences far beyond the valley itself. The children's drawings suddenly made sense in a way that was horrifying. The tunnels, the shapes, the symbols they had been witnessing and encoding knowledge too vast and disturbing for words. The eldest child's whispered warnings about what lived beneath were no longer cryptic. The evidence in this chamber confirmed that the Darrington adults had devoted their lives to maintaining control over something terrifying, something the outside world would never be prepared to confront. Attempts to document the chamber fully were limited by necessity. The federal agents decided that some evidence was too dangerous, too psychologically destabilizing, to release even to local authorities. Portions of the tunnels were sealed again, left intact, preserved as a record of the family's practices but hidden from public view. The official story released to the media and the public was sanitized, describing only a missing persons case, children found in isolation, and the curious layout of an old property. The truth, the full depth of what had been uncovered in the tunnels, the rituals, the warnings, and the possibility of forces the children had barely survived is something the government classified, something that remains unspoken. Those who ventured too close to the Darrington property, whether investigators or locals, describe a lingering unease, a cold that seeps into the bones, and a quiet knowledge that the valley holds secrets far darker than anyone will ever admit.